What's up guys, and welcome back to another eBay miniature rescue. Today, we're going to be painting some lizard men. So I really wanted to try something a little bit different for this model. You know, I've been going pretty grim dark lately, and I wanted to push the color for this. Now, there were a few suggestions of people saying, hey, I would love to see a grim dark version of Seraphon, but, you know, I'm feeling these bright colors lately. So we're going to try something a little bit different, some real world examples, and kind of see where that takes us. I'm also going to be putting this model up on eBay this week, so it'll be a 7-day auction starting right now, so links in the description for that, and it will be ending next Sunday. So let's head on over to the table and see what we can do with this Starpriest. So since I'm tackling a Starpriest this week, I decided to go to Google Images and look up some interesting lizard skin. A couple of these pictures really jumped out at me, and I really wanted to try and replicate this on this lizard man. Now, it's not going to be exactly like this. I'm not going to use all the same colors. I'm mainly going to shoot for some orange and some blue. So let's get started with some Stynylrez black primer, and then I'm going to do a zenithal and kind of a pre-highlight with some white ink. The main goal with this highlight is to really push that white value so that when we come back with, say, an ink or a contrast paint, we're going to get a nice shift in color. Now, we're really going to make a mess when we come in with the next paint. So I'm going to have to be reapplying this white ink pretty often. Now, the nice thing is that this ink is super thin, and through the airbrush, it doesn't build up pretty much at all. And that's something to really keep in mind when you're working pretty thin with these inks, is that if you need to come back, that's perfectly fine. Now, I did notice when I was putting this on that there is a nasty mold line right down the front of his face. And you're probably thinking, wow, this is just gonna completely ruin all the work we've done. But the nice thing is you can take some of this Stynylrez primer and just reapply it. So what I did is I scraped the mold line off, reapplied the primer with a brush, let that dry, and then just came back in with that ink, and you can't even tell that there was a mold line. In a nutshell, just keep in mind that paint is paint. You can take it off and put more on. So if you ever find yourself in this situation, don't worry about it and just continue working. Now that we have fixed that mold line and reapplied our ink, I'm going to do something a little bit different than I normally do. I'm going to come in with a black oil wash. The idea of using a black oil wash at this stage, you know, putting it right over the top of our white ink, is that we're going to fill all of the recesses with a really dark wash. And that way, when we come back with some filter colors through the airbrush and kind of airbrush glaze this on, it's going to pick up those color variations a little bit more. So we've got some nice gradients with our white ink, and then we've got really dark recesses where that color isn't necessarily going to show up as much. So we're going to get a nice pre-shaded miniature, essentially, and because it's an oil wash, we have a good amount of control. Now, I do need to mention that I did spray this model with some varnish beforehand, and that was just to protect the ink and everything else underneath that, so that when we come back in with this Q-tip and start to wipe away a lot of this oil, we're not going to damage any of that undercoat. The really cool thing about using an oil wash like this is that you do have that control. You can take that paint away. And in the end, we come out with a pretty nice pre-shaded model that we can start to lay down some color on. In order to start to create base coats that kind of match that chameleon that I showed earlier, I'm going to start with some Gryph-hound orange through the airbrush. Now, because this is a contrast paint, we can go right over the top of this stuff really thin, and it's going to pick up those color variations that we laid down. Right now, I'm just trying to get a pretty thin layer that gives an idea of where these colors are going to go. And then I'm going to come back in with some regular paints and start to do a lot of brush work and really intensify those colors to try and match kind of what that chameleon had going on. The second color we're going to come in with is Pterodon Turquoise, and this is the same idea as the orange, but I'm going to go for more of the top down instead of from the bottom up. And that way we get kind of a nice shift in value from this turquoise to the orange. So, like I said earlier, I'm going to have to continually go back to white in order to kind of reintroduce some of those highlights and those gradients. And we're going to come back in with some of these other colors, including this new one, Aethermatic Blue, and start to push those highlights a little bit further. Now, this is a little bit of back and forth, going from white to orange and that kind of thing, because contrast paint doesn't really work over black. Now, I'm trying to be as light as possible to preserve that oil wash that we used so that all of those recesses still remain pretty dark. Mainly, I'm focusing the white on those feathers on top. I'm going to employ one of my favorite tricks for doing kind of random animal skin. I'm going to grab some dried moss and kind of spread that apart and then shoot whatever color I want to be, randomly spotted around the miniature through that moss. And that's just going to give us a little bit of this orange kind of in just random variations. And that way, when we come back in with a brush, we can start to push those and really make some nice looking patterns. What this is really accomplishing is just taking the guesswork out of doing freehand on a model. Because it's random, I'm getting some nice, uneven, more natural looking spots that I can then go and highlight. And we don't really have to think about where we're placing anything. To work up our feathers, I'm going to start off with Magos Purple. This is a pretty nice purple. It's not super dark, and it has a little bit of pink in it. So I'm going to use this as a base coat, and then we're going to come back in with an even brighter color, Golden's Fluorescent Pink, to finish off the kind of upper half of each of those feathers. The more that I have been using this golden paint, the more that I like it. It's really thin, it shoots through the airbrush perfectly. I don't have to thin it or mix it with anything, and the pigment is extremely intense. So doing the pink on the ends of these feathers really highlights those, and they stand out extremely well. To finish off these main feathers, I'm just going to put a little bit of white back into the airbrush and just hit the tips of those feathers. And that's really just going to brighten these things up quite a bit and give us a pretty nice gradient from the Magos Purple to the Fluorescent Pink all the way up to those white tips. Now we're going to get a little bit closer to this model. We're going to start with Troll Slayer Orange with a brush and really start to push the values of those kind of random orange spots that we have all over this model. One of the nice things about this model in particular is that there's quite a bit of detail sculpted in throughout this model. Now, there's obviously the larger scales on the back, but there are also some really small ones that are running down the legs. Because we did that oil wash earlier, it really defined those areas. So I'm trying to come in and follow the lines that are sculpted into this model and highlight in that manner. So I'm using a whole bunch of little lines and kind of stippling on each of the little individual scales as best I can in order to make this look as natural as possible. In order to highlight all of the blue on the model, I'm going to start with Lothern Blue and then gradually add a little bit of white. In the areas that have all of the orange striping, I'm going to use pretty much straight Lothern Blue to go in between that orange. So we're going to have a nice mix of this, bright orange and bright blue in between. So we're going to get a nice striped effect. On any of the larger scales, especially running down his back, I'm going to, from the bottom up, push that pigment towards the top. And that way we're kind of layering up to the top, and then gradually adding more white as we get closer to that top and highlighting from there. So when we complete this effect, it has a really nice kind of dark to light effect running up his entire back, but also on each of the individual scales. I do need to throw something out there. The other day, Brent over at Goobertown Hobbies posted up a really awesome video on layering and painting scales for Seraphon. Now, this is a little bit of a coincidence that I kind of had this on my desk, but we've also been talking about Seraphon for the last couple of weeks on our podcast, Paint Bravely. If you haven't seen that video that Brent posted, I highly recommend going to check that out. I'm going to throw that in the description, and I'm going to put it right here. Jumping ahead just a little bit, I'm base coating all of the metallics using Vallejo Metal Color Gold. So normally I'm not the biggest fan of the actual color of this gold, but in this case it works pretty well. We've got a nice amount of green in this yellow, so that plays off of our purples quite a bit. Speaking of purple, I'm coming back in with some Magos purple to take care of the other feathers on the model. Now there's one on each of his arms, as well as 3 that make up kind of a feathery loincloth. There are a couple of reasons why I decided to brush this on rather than go with the airbrush. Now I could have used something to mask off the rest of the model. Silly Putty actually works incredibly well for doing that. But I wanted the feathers to be not quite as bright as the rest of them. I wanted the head plume to kind of be your main focus. And that's a good thing to think about when you're painting models, is that you want to focus your attention kind of on the central area, wherever the face is. So we want those feathers to be brighter. Coming in with this purple on these lower feathers, since we have a gradient from the white ink that we did earlier, it looks pretty good, and you're really not paying attention to those when you look at this model generally. And in order to highlight some of those kind of brighter areas where that ink was more intense, I'm going to use some of this fluorescent pink just to kind of make those feathery striations. Now you can kind of see that detail. They're not super detailed feathers, but kind of running in the same direction as the lines that you can see is going to make it look as feathery as possible. I'm going to use a 50-50 mix of Reikland Flesh Shade and Reikland Flesh Shade Gloss to pretty much shade all of the gold metal. Now, using a 50-50 mix like that is going to maintain the shininess of that metal, because normally Reikland Flesh Shade kind of dulls your metallics down. But having a little bit of that gloss medium in there just keeps that shine and just maintains your metallic look. One of my absolute favorite colors that I've recently come across is this Scale 75's Arbuckle's Brown. Now, the reason that I like this color quite a bit is because it's really versatile. Now, the more paint that you put on, the more opaque that becomes and the more dark brown it becomes. It's kind of like a Rhinox hide from Games Workshop. But if you put it on lightly, it's got this kind of purple tint to it. So I can put it over the wood staff and go pretty heavy on that, and it's a nice dark brown wood. And then on all of the leather, I go over it pretty lightly, and you get this kind of brownish purple leather. It's a pretty cool paint. In order to highlight our gold, I'm going to start with Vallejo Metal Color Gold and progressively add a little bit more of the aluminum. The nice thing about using metallics like this is that they mix together really well. So when you want to place a brighter highlight, you can go really far with that and then go over that just a little bit with some of the kind of slightly less mixed down version and start to blend those together. And this metal color works really well for that. I'm also going to edge highlight all of the metal with pretty much pure aluminum, and that just gives kind of a nice framing around all of it and just makes it look really bright. One of the last things that we're going to have to do is take care of the eyes. So I'm just going to lay down some Vallejo white into each of the eyes, and then go over that pretty lightly and just build it up with this fluorescent pink. And that's going to give a really nice punch with that pink. So because I'm putting this model up on eBay, I wanted to make the base kind of as generic as possible. So I went with kind of a grassland and just put some tufts on there. So right before we close out, I just want to remind everybody that this model will be going up on eBay. So if you would like to support this channel, then head on over to the auction and check it out. I am extremely grateful for all of the other models that you've gotten through these auctions. It's really helped to push this channel forward and help me build a new studio. This is something I've been working on for quite some time, and it's finally come to the point where work has begun. I'll show a little bit of a preview right at the end of this video of some of the work that's been done, so if you're interested in how that's going, stick around and see what it's all about. Thank you for joining me on another eBay miniature rescue. If you like something about this video, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing, as it really helps out the channel. Once again, I'm Casey, and I will see you in the next video. So I don't have a ton of stuff this week. I do have an insane amount of models that actually just came in, but I need to go through all that stuff before I start to show that and really get into what's next. So next week is going to be a little bit of a surprise, and I think even for me. That's all right. Here's the preview of the new studio space. It's something that I've been wanting to do for quite some time, and I'm pretty happy with so far. Now, there's still some more work that needs to be done. We have to get some furniture in, some desks, got to run some more power through the ceiling, that kind of thing, but you know, it's getting there, and I can't wait to show the full reveal pretty soon. So thanks again for sticking around, guys. I really appreciate it, and I will talk to you later.